Hi guys, this is Gevork from Gev's Book Reviews, and today I'm going to be reviewing a book called The Kite Runner, which was written by Khalid Hosseini in the year 2003 and was made into a movie in the year 2007. This is like a redemption story at its core. There's this character named Amir who had this moment or this event in his life where he let down his friend Hassan, um, and had this cowardly moment where he wasn't there for him. And it's something that played in the back of his mind for many, many years until he finally had an opportunity to redeem himself and do something for his friend Hassan. So that's at the core of it. That's what it is. There's a lot of things that happen in this book, so I'm worried as I summarize it's going to take forever. But I'm going to do my best. I'm going to try to really get to the big points. So basically, Amir and Hassan are really close friends. They grow up together. Hassan is his servant, and Hassan and Ali are the servants to Amir's family. Amir and his father, Bapa, referred to as Bapa, which just means father. And they're great friends, but there's this thing that kind of divides them or separates them, which is that Hassan is a Hazari, which is this religious and I guess kind of religious ethnic minority in Afghanistan. So that always creates, and of course he's his servant, so there's a socioeconomic divide as well. But somehow they transcend that and they're good friends. But one day they're in this kite running competition, and Hassan and Amir are competing with each other, and they actually end up winning first place. And he cuts down the kite, this blue kite, and ends up winning it. And then Hassan goes after the kite and chases it so that he can give it back to Amir. And then he's confronted by this kid named Asef, who's just this horrible kid. He's just this kind of like a fascist type character. He looks at Hassan, and because he's like a minority in his country, he has contempt for him, and he actually rapes Hassan. And Amir notices him being raped. He sees it, but he doesn't do anything about it. And he's just has so much guilt, and it just feels so terrible about it. Eventually, it's so bad that he figures out a way to kind of basically get Hassan out of his life. He lies and says that Hassan stole something, and tries to convince his father that of that, and they end up no longer being their servants. In the meantime, the country is sort of falling apart. The Soviets have taken over, and they actually decide, Amir and his father decide to leave the country. They end up going to Pakistan, and then they actually end up eventually going to the United States. So in the United States, now the story progresses. Amir ends up falling in love with a woman named Soraya, not sure how you pronounce it. They get married. Bapa ends up getting sick with cancer. He ends up eventually passing away. And then eventually, as we're getting towards the end of the story, he gets a letter from a man named Rahim Khan, who is a good friend of Bapa. And he says, I'm feeling kind of ill. I'm close to my death. Rahim Khan was a good fatherly figure to Amir when he was growing up in Afghanistan. So when he tells him, he's about to pass away, I want us to meet before I go. Amir agrees to that. So he leaves the U.S. and goes on a trip to meet Rahim Khan. Now, when he meets with Rahim Khan, he finds out what happened to Hassan. And what he finds out is that, first of all, Hassan married someone. They had a kid together. His kid's name was Sohrab. But eventually, because of the Taliban coming into power, and of course they're not particularly, friendly to the Hazaris, they basically massacred all of them, and so they ended up killing Hassan, not Hassan, but well, Hassan and his wife, and his kid was orphaned. Sohrab was orphaned, and he tells Amir, you know what? That kid is your responsibility, and he said, the orphanage that he's in, he's not going to make it if he's there, and I want you to take him out of this orphanage and move him to this orphanage in Pakistan, and basically kind of save his life. And he told him, you owe it to Hassan to do that, because he actually knew what happened from Hassan, the whole thing that happened, where he saw Hassan being raped and he didn't do anything about it. And Amir, deep in his heart, also knew that, that event was underneath the surface of everything in his life, and he felt like he had to redeem himself. And maybe this was the only way to do it. And then what he also finds out incredibly in this particular encounter is that Hassan is actually his half-brother. It turns out that Bappa is actually Hassan's father. So all along we thought that Hassan's father was Ali, who was also servant to Bappa, but we find out that actually Hassan had an affair with Ali's wife and ended up having Hassan as his child. So all this time that they were growing up together, Hassan was actually Bappa's father, just like Amir. And he was just sort of left behind. So there's a lot of these different things that come into play, and then now it's like, wow, I really do have to do something. I owe it to Hassan, who's my brother actually, not just a friend, my half brother, to redeem myself for what I did. And so he ends up going to Afghanistan, and he eventually finds Sohrab. It turns out Sohrab is like this kid has become like a sex slave, and he's actually a sex slave to Asef. We find that Asef appears again in the book, and so now we're in a situation where Amir has to confront Asef again, the same person that actually raped Hassan earlier in the book. And Asef is able to recognize him. Even he had like a fake beard on, Amir. And, he just goes off on him. He just beats him up like crazy, almost kills him. But eventually Sohrab, who was there, has a slingshot. He ends up, hitting Asef's eye and blinds him, and they run away together. So then they go to Pakistan, and they're and now at this point, because remember, Amir never really was able to have a kid, and so he has this idea, and he tells Sohrab, "What if I adopt you? Do you want to be my son? And we can grow up together in the United States." And he goes and talks to immigration lawyers and this and that, and eventually it appears that the best option is Sohrab has to go back to an orphanage for some period of time, and then he can get adopted. And so that's what he tells Sohrab. But when he hears this, Sohrab is like, "No, I can't. I don't want to go to that anymore for obvious reasons. Look at how terrible his life was in that situation." And he actually ends up, when he gets this news, he actually ends up cutting himself and almost killing himself. And he's taken to the hospital. Eventually, he's able to recover, and eventually they take Sohrab. They do take Sohrab to the United States, but when he's there, he has like an entire year in the U.S. where he doesn't really talk. For whatever reason. So now they've already moved in. He's living there with with Soraya, and which is Amir's wife, and they're basically trying to start this family together in the United States. And the final scene is like, they're out in San Francisco, and he sees these kids running kites, and Amir and Sorab are together with his wife, and Amir grabs one of the kites, and he starts kind of going back to his childhood when he was running kites with Hassan. And Sorab is fascinated by it, and he's like, Amir tells him, "Hey, do you want to try?" And he's like, "Yeah, let me give it a shot." And then he starts doing it, and for the first time in like a year, he finally smiles, and he doesn't really say anything, but it's at least some feeling of hope that maybe now Sorab is going to integrate into America, and that all this tragedy and all this suffering that he had, he can put it behind him, and live a happy life with his with his parents, basically his new parents, which is Amir and Soraya. So that's where you sort of feel like Amir was able to redeem himself for letting down Hassan early in his life. So that's a mouthful. I tried to make that as short as possible, but I mean, there's so many different things that come up. It's hard to really summarize it, but that's kind of the basic story, and I liked it. I mean, I like this book. It's there's a lot of humanity in it. There's a lot of explores a lot of different things. It explores, courage, and we all have moments in our life where we're presented with something, with a challenge, we're confronted with something, and sometimes we fail. Sometimes we don't have the courage to confront that, and I've had that many times in my life, and some of those moments still I ruminate over, often. And imagine how Amir would have felt with this terrible event that happened to Hassan. It literally, was something that was in the back of his mind in his entire life. Like even when he was trying to have a kid and he was unable to, he would be like, maybe that's God's punishment for what I did, where I didn't do anything to help my friend Hassan. This book also, I think, kind of explores society, the evolution of society. You look at what happens in Afghanistan and all these changes that occur in the country. It seems like no matter what change happens, things seem to just get worse. The Bappa character is an interesting guy. He's a very proud, traditional type guy, and it's just sad to see that the country changed so much that they just couldn't live there anymore, and they had to flee to America. He didn't really want to live in America. Afghanistan was really his home, and even the same with Soraya's father-in-law, who's this general in Afghanistan. I didn't talk about him earlier, but he's same way. Like he was on welfare, and he's like, I'm not going to work here in the States. I'm just going to wait until things get better in Afghanistan and go back there. So there's a lot of that where you have people that are, their home is not the U.S. Their home is Afghanistan. That's their culture. That's where their heart lives. And unfortunately, the country disintegrated so much that really they had no choice but to flee. And the Bappa character was an interesting guy. He definitely, and really the whole book, the culture reminds me a lot of the culture I'm from, which is the Armenian culture. There's a lot of, the food and even like little words here and there sounded familiar. For example, they always use terms like Amir John. John is like you'll hear that in Armenian vernacular too. It's kind of like a term of affection. You'll say something like Gevorg John, which is just simply saying my friend Gevorg, and so you see that a lot in the book. And I guess that resonated with me a little bit because of my cultural background. That was kind of interesting to read. There's probably a lot of similarities between our cultures, and it's a very traditional culture, and that's why, like for example, the Amir character, he ends up being a writer. He goes to school to study creative writing, and his father's always like, why are you studying that? You should be a doctor, or you should be a lawyer or an engineer or whatever. I'm sure a lot of people have heard stuff like that if they grew up in certain traditional cultures. And also just the way that the marriages work, and all that. There's certain patriarchal aspects to it that I think is interesting when you read. So yeah, I mean, those are some of the elements of this book. It's a very sad story. I mean, there's a lot of like for example, towards the end of the book, when you know see what happens is initially Amir thinks that the only way that really things could work out for Sorab is if he goes back to an orphanage. But then he later finds out, like, he's in touch with his wife, and they get in touch with a lawyer here and a lawyer there, and they find out there's actually a path towards him getting adopted. But by the time he had figured that out, he had already told Sorab that you may have to go back to an orphanage. And then he goes and sees Sorab has like cut himself and he's killed himself. And I thought, oh my God, is this book going to end with this misunderstanding, like a Romeo and Juliet type misunderstanding where, the guy, if he just waited like a day, he would have found out he was going to get adopted, but he ended up killing himself. Then he's in the hospital for like weeks and weeks at a time. And he's still kind of traumatized over it. Like I said in the summary, like he spends a year in America with like barely talking to Amir and his wife's Soraya. So there's just something off with the kid, which is understandable given the tragedy of his childhood. His parents are killed and he's just like a sex slave to this terrible person. It's just a disaster. There's just so much suffering that happens here in this book, and then eventually, at least in the end, there's some glimmer of hope that things are going to be okay. So, anyways, I think the book is kind of like a story of a hero, someone who redeems himself, and it's ultimately, I think, an uplifting story. It's pretty stark contrast to the previous book I read, which was Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which is kind of this nihilistic book. And here you have a book with a lot of great people in it, great, very noble and heroic characters. Amir, in the end, becomes quite heroic, and I think the Papa character is quite honorable. Hassan, this young man, Hassan is a wonderful character. Like, he's the nicest, most decent person you're going to ever meet, and honestly, that's part of his demise, perhaps, is because he was too nice. And Sorab, his son, I think, is also a good person, or good kid, despite he obviously has a lot of trauma that he's confronting, but you're happy to see that he was finally able to find a loving home. So overall, I like this book. I'll probably give it maybe like 4.5 stars out of 5. I may not even do these stars towards after this. I don't think this is really, giving a star rating means a whole lot. But I did enjoy it, and I recommend it. And for the people here that might have read this book, I'm curious what you guys think. Like, what were your takeaways from reading it? Did you like it? Maybe a criticism of the book, if anything, is it's almost too sad, almost too tragic. Like I was saying, that thing at the very end where he cuts himself and he almost kills himself. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, is he really gonna, just when he's about to find out that he's gonna be adopted, he's gonna we're adding another like horrible tragedy on top of this. And then, the Aesop character is so evil. It's like, is that even too much of an archetype to be that evil? Like he didn't have a single redeeming quality to him. But there are evil people in this world, so maybe it's not such a stretch. But yeah, I mean, overall, it was an interesting book. I think some of the middle parts of the book where he's in America and stuff like that, the story kind of settles down a little bit. Not as much happens. But so I think a lot of the action really is at the beginning and the end, where things are happening in Afghanistan. But I think you needed some of that storyline, for example, to realize why it would make sense for Amir to actually adopt this kid. So I think it created some backstory that fitted nicely with the tail end of the book. Anyways, I enjoyed it. Please let me know if anyone has any comments or thoughts about this book or the channel overall. Yeah, just feel free to comment below. Like the video, subscribe if you haven't already. I'm curious to see how this channel is going to play itself out. I think one thing I want to improve on or think about is how can this channel be more of a discussion? Because just me going up and having a monologue for 20 minutes. I hope you guys enjoy it, but I also am curious like how we can have this be more of a discussion. One idea I have at least is, I'll let people know before I read my next book what it's going to be. So before I make my next video, I'll let people know so that they can actually read along with me, so that by the time I make the next video, at least some people have read the book and they have some thoughts on it. At least they can comment in the video what they think about it. I guess YouTube also has a discussion section, so we could use that for any discussion as well as the comments. But anyways, if you guys have any thoughts on how we can, I mean, I even had a crazy idea, if I'm not committing to it, but maybe we can figure out a way to actually have like multiple people talking about a book. If some people with it that are subscribed to this channel have read the book that I'm about to review, maybe we can just have like a Zoom discussion about it and make that the video. I'm not saying I'll always do that, but it's just maybe we could have explore stuff like that as well. But anyways, I think I'm talking too much. I hope you guys liked the video, and I'll be doing another one hopefully sooner rather than later. Have a great day, everyone.